Hi everyone, welcome to Equals. This is Naf.
Hi everyone, this is Max and Naf. Me and you back together again. I mean, it only feels like yesterday we were interviewing Jason Hickel, so good to be back together.
Yes, great to be back. And I'm really happy to see, Jason's interview did really well. I feel like it resonated with a lot of people across the world. So that was fantastic.
Yeah, that was really good. It was an amazing interview, and I think loads of people listened to it all over the place. So really, really good. And today we've got another fantastic guest, the author, activist, journalist Grace Blakeley from here in the UK. She's just brilliant, and been wanting to get her on Equals for a long time. But in particular, since she released her recent book, VULTURE Capitalism, which I think has lots of amazing ideas in it that really build on the points that Jason was making, the points we were making in our Davos report about, billionaires not just being super rich, but billionaires controlling our economy. So, yeah, it's great we can interview her.
Really excited, Max, because I was telling my friends about Grace. And I think they follow her on Twitter, and a lot of them have also read her books. So, yeah, really excited. Looking forward to the interview.
Let's do it. Hi, Grace. Welcome to Equals. It's fantastic to finally get you on the podcast.
It's really, really great to have you with us, especially given, the state of the world. You're the right person to talk to for a better understanding. For instance, the rise of the oligarchy in the US. And the first question actually links to this. When you saw all those billionaires, lined up behind Trump at his inauguration, what did you think? What was your immediate reaction?
So, on the one hand, it was obviously a very stark image and one that kind of, refracted around the world very quickly. On the other hand, it struck me that there were quite a lot of continuity. The relationship between not just the Republican Party, but the American political establishment and the US billionaire class has always been extremely close. So, even just looking back to the last Trump administration, you had Rex Tillerson, for example, former CEO of ExxonMobil, serving under Donald Trump. And I think this is something that I look at in my book, Vulture Capitalism, is just that there have always been these kind of deep, pervasive and extensive links between allegedly kind of solely private corporations and then the apparatus of big and powerful states like the US. And really what the book looks at is the kind of lie that we live in these like free market democratic societies in which you have this clear distinction between the public and private sector, between markets and states. And that actually, modern capitalist economies are characterized by this kind of fusion between public and private power in service of the interests at the top. So it was not surprising to me to see all these kind of very wealthy people lined up behind Trump. I think, the kind of narrative that has underpinned the legitimacy of this system for a long time, which is that you have the public sector and you have the private sector, and the private sector is works based on markets and the public sector is democratic. That's always been a pretty clear lie, but now it's been shown to be kind of starkly false.
Here's a debate that we have inside Oxfam. Who are the worst bad guys, the billionaires or the corporates? And to what extent are corporates acting on behalf of an elite class? I mean, we've always been quite billionaire focused as Oxfam, but a lot of the movement are very much about corporate power. And I'm wondering how you see that link between the individuals themselves and the kind of broader but important factor of corporate power itself.
I think it's really important to look less at individuals and more at structures. Despite the fact that we have this idea in much of the Western world that the politics of left and right is basically a politics of states versus markets. There's actually a much older tradition which looks at the way in which state power is used to support and promote the interests of private individuals and powerful corporations. And it's that literature I really drew on to kind of try and understand how the state works today. And in that sense, you really see that in capitalist societies, so societies characterized by this divide between a small number of people who own all the things and everyone else who's forced to work for a living, political structures tend to reflect the kind of balance of power within society as a whole. But it's also very clear that these state institutions aren't independent either. Instead, the kind of outcomes that we see and the policy outcomes that we see tend to reflect the general balance of power. So, that looks like, for example, big bailouts for financial institutions after the financial crisis, or corporations during COVID at the same time as everyone else experienced cuts and severe hardship.
One of the things most people understand about neoliberalism is they don't like government. They want a free market. They want to get government out of the way. But I think in your book, you're effectively saying that they might say that, but they don't really mean that. So what do you mean by this? I really like this idea of capitalist planning.
Yeah, so the argument in the book is basically that this whole narrative around freedom that we had in the 1980s, which was shrink the state, reduce the size of the government, and you will expand the space for free markets. And in doing so, you will promote human freedom. And this came from the argument of economists like Hayek, for example, who said that, any expansion in the size of the state in the form of, greater spending on healthcare or social security would inevitably lead towards a kind of totalitarian system of the kind that you saw in, for example, Soviet Russia. He said that relying too much on the state would lead these societies down the road to serfdom. So if you really cared about freedom, then you had to be on the side of the right, which was to say shrink the state and create this kind of expanded space for markets. But this, I show in the book, was always just a really clever kind of Trojan horse strategy. You would dress up the neoliberal project in the language of freedom, and it ended up actually dramatically curtailing lots of people's freedom at the same time as, expanding the freedom of a small number of people, particularly when you think about their ability to kind of move their money around the world, escape government regulation, etc. When it comes to most people, neoliberalism was associated with actually a very kind of violent and overbearing state. So if you look at, for example, the use of force against striking miners in the 1980s, against climate protesters today, the state is very rigorous and powerful when it comes to punishing anyone who basically kind of poses a threat to the status quo. And at the same time, even when it comes to state intervention within markets, neoliberalism was actually associated with a very powerful and active state within allegedly free markets. So, you can see that obviously with the response to the financial crisis of 2008. But in general, government spending on things like corporate welfare, subsidies for powerful corporations, and on measures that would generally benefit a small number of quite powerful vested interests increased quite substantially. What really changed was the balance of power. Basically, it was whose interests were being served by this large and powerful state. And you really see from the 1980s onwards, it becomes much more oriented towards serving the interests of a kind of growing billionaire class than it does those of society as a whole. And that both reflects and reinforces what I referred to earlier, which is a shift in the balance of power. So prior to the neoliberal transformation, organized labor, social movements had much more of an influence, both in terms of kind of setting the agenda within politics, but also formally within public institutions, within state institutions. The whole kind of post-war consensus was based on this idea that politicians would kind of mediate between labor and capital and come up with solutions. And what changed in the 80s isn't that the state got smaller or less interventionist. It's actually that organized labor and social movements were cut out of that decision-making process, and instead state policy just comes to reflect the interests of basically capital.
And Grace, what are the implications of this capitalist planning for ordinary people, especially in the global south?
Yeah, so coming to this point about capitalist planning, it kind of sounds like a bit of an oxymoron, doesn't it? Because the whole idea that we're often presented with is that you have kind of free market capitalist societies on the one hand, in which the production and allocation of resources is mediated by the market, and on the other hand, you have kind of centrally planned socialist societies in which the state plans who gets what. And my argument in the book is that actually, through all the mechanisms that I've outlined already, what we have is actually kind of a form of planned capitalism. So rather than resources being kind of produced and allocated according to the logic of the free market and competition, you actually see very powerful monopolies and oligopolies that make decisions, effectively plan who gets what. And they're supported by states that intervene frequently and regularly to promote those same interests. So you have this kind of nexus of public-private planning, always in pursuit of the kind of maximization of the power and wealth of those at the very top of society. And you see this particularly starkly taking place at an international level. So there's lots of examples that you can look at of kind of capitalist planning domestically, but internationally it becomes very, very stark because the whole architecture of the global economy is basically set during the kind of the 70s and 80s by this kind of very influential group of in inverted commas, free market economists who set up a world economy that is, created in the name of free markets, but has very, very little to do with free markets and actually has everything to do with kind of entrenching the power of capital. And a really good example of this is the changes that were made to kind of capital mobility, so the ability of money basically to move around the world, of people to move their money around the world. Now, in the kind of classic neoliberal framing of this being about freedom, this shift was set up as a human rights issue. So the idea that was that everyone should have the human right to capital flight. You should be able to go anywhere and take your money with you. And it was a very powerful framing, but it, of course, was never really about human rights. It was about kind of ensuring that wealthy individuals and large corporations could move their money often to tax havens, but also that they could use their economic power as a kind of disciplining tool over sovereign governments. So, if you didn't like a policy in a particular area and you happened to own a corporation that employed a lot of people in that area, you could say, right, okay, we're leaving. We're taking our money and moving somewhere else. And this is, of course, a threat that is used quite a lot when governments attempt to, say, increase corporation tax or expand labor or environmental regulation. And I suppose the peak manifestation of this today is the idea of the kind of economic zone. And these are spaces that are created kind of within sovereign territories where there's basically very low tax rates, very little regulation, where, corporations are able to do whatever they want effectively. And then adding to this argument about kind of, capitalist planning and the regulation of global capitalism, there have been a number of measures that have been put in place when it comes to international rules and norms that, again, have been designed to kind of promote the power of capital over labor and also rich countries over poor ones. And I think the best example of this are investor state dispute settlements. So these are provisions written into investment treaties, often bilateral investment treaties, that allow private corporations to sue governments if those governments implement regulation that harms corporate profit. So this whole architecture of the world economy was planned with the justification that these measures would promote freedom, but with the result of actually deepening and embedding these vast inequalities of power between rich and poor people and rich and poor countries.
When we were talking about the capitalist planning, Grace, how does it impact our ability to address, the climate crisis? And does it hinder or help our efforts? And what needs to change to effectively, address the climate and inequality crisis?
So I think that is a really important consideration because there is this idea that, we need a form of kind of big government centralized planning to be able to combat the climate crisis. And you see this narrative being pushed a lot, particularly in kind of liberal spheres, of we don't really have time for democracy when it comes to climate. We need to basically rely on the individuals and institutions that already have power. So, the kind of the argument that you often see that we need kind of like war planning to tackle the climate crisis, I actually don't find particularly convincing. What we need to tackle climate breakdown is democratic planning. So that looks like everything from, allowing small scale experiments with kind of community energy and a decentralized grid, right? Things that are kind of interesting and exciting and you can do now. But it also requires decision making at the level of the national economy that represents the interests of the people rather than just billionaires. How would that work? Well, it's things like, you could have a national investment bank whose investment strategies were determined through kind of democratic processes with a mandate for decarbonization. The same with I came up with the idea for a people's asset manager, which would kind of invest and hold assets as investments for on behalf of a particular community. Things like central banking, for example, which has become really important when we're thinking about decarbonization because of the assets that central banks are buying. What would a democratic central bank look like? And, people will often say, right, well, we don't have time. The democracy is slow and it's inefficient. But ultimately, it's literally all we have, because without democracy, without representation of ordinary people's interests, you literally just have billionaires controlling the government.
So these days, with so much chaos around us, Grace, inequality and poverty getting worse, it's really hard to see how to fight back and where to find hope, no? So what keeps you going? What is your advice to our listeners for keeping up the fight against inequality?
This is something I've been thinking a lot about recently because, I've spent most of my career so far basically just writing about capitalism and all of the kind of inequality and injustices that it generates. And indeed, kind of trying to participate in like electoral political projects to try and shift that from the top down. But what I've started to look at much more recently are actually like bottom up strategies for like fomenting resistance from the ground up. And I've now started a newsletter called What Can We Do, which is looking every week at different examples of kind of grassroots struggles for economic justice, from the union movement to various different social movements to co-ops, community organizing, etc. And the reason I've done that isn't because I've suddenly decided, oh, okay, well, government isn't important, state power isn't important, electoral politics isn't important. It's because the more I've spoken to people, the more I've become convinced that the reason that we're seeing such significant shifts towards the far right, and the reason that we're seeing fewer people voting and fewer people engaging in politics, and basically political parties able to increasingly do what they want because there are so few people holding them to account, isn't because people don't care. It's not because people don't think the system is broken. It's because they feel powerless. So many people in so many different parts of society feel deeply and profoundly powerless and isolated. And that is very unsurprising given the kind of concentrated political and economic power that governs our economy. But also because, another big part of the neoliberal shift that we haven't spoken about was this shift towards individualism. The idea that we are all isolated, we're competing against one another, that it is on us. Everything is on us. We have to protect ourselves. And that is a fundamentally isolating and disempowering way to view the world. It's why I think so many people feel so hopeless and feel so disengaged. They're like, well, I can't change anything in my life, let alone in the world. So why would I bother engaging in politics? And I think when you start to see people challenging that individualism and that isolation and coming together in their communities, in their workplaces, on the streets and social movements, and kind of challenging those with power and trying to build different sorts of institutions that represent their interests. That's not just something that achieves change in people's lives today. It gives people a sense of their ability and their agency to transform whole systems. It gives people a sense of connection, community, belonging, and empowerment, which is basically something that is, the key political idea that is missing from so much of what we're talking about today. I'm actually, given all of the research I'm doing on community organizing, on tenants coming together to hold rogue landlords to account before getting involved in local politics and changing regulation, through to people setting up co-ops that are creating community energy companies that provide cheap energy to local communities and then create jobs and reinvest their profits back into building community spaces, through to labor organizers who are taking on some of the biggest and most powerful corporations on the planet and winning and losing, but never actually giving up. All of these things give me such profound hope. Even as you look at the news every day and you see, oh, great, another terrible, terrible thing has happened. What you don't see are all the incredible pockets of resistance to this model that exist everywhere. But those are so powerful, and they're only going to continue to grow as people look at the society that we've built and think this isn't right.
Wow, beautiful.
Thank you, Grace. That was brilliant. Keep up the amazing work. We love the book, and so glad we managed to make this happen. So we really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Great interview, Max. What stood out for you?
I really like Grace. I really loved her book. I really like the idea of capitalist planning. I think that's a great concept.
Definitely, Max. Like for me, all of us need to understand whatever is happening around the world in terms of, the economic, political organization. It's by design. Even the idea of free market is by design, no? Meaning the global economy is organized in a way to benefit capital, in a way to benefit the richest, in a way to benefit, those few with power, instead of us thinking, this is just happening in a bubble or in a market that's treating everyone equally.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, the point is not that there's kind of one room full of smoke and one master plan and one conspiracy theory. I think her point is more nuanced than that, isn't it? It's just that there is, across all of the economy, a very close relationship between corporates, billionaire shareholders and governments, and that they work together to structure the economy to their benefit. So, and often they might be, have different interests, competing with each other in different ways, but the idea that it's all left completely to the free market and competition, I think, is completely untrue. And there is an element of kind of organized planning for and on behalf of the richest, ultimately, which made a lot of sense to me.
Exactly. And also related with this, Max, which I actually disagree with Grace. At the beginning, she was saying, when she saw all these oligarchs standing next to Trump, she was not surprised. Nothing new. This relationship has always existed. But I actually feel like things are different this time around. No, it's like so much power in your face.
Yeah, no, I agree. I don't. I see what she means about there being a continuity, and there have always been big businessmen involved with the US government. That is true, but I think this feels qualitatively different, and if only because it's, as you say, so in your face. Everyone can see, the power of billionaires is not in how many yachts they've got or how many houses. It's buying the media, it's buying politics, not just in your own country, but in other countries too. That feels really, really clear to everyone now, and that is different.
I really hope people will see how, a selected few are amassing power, also manipulating the system, for their own gain. And I hope this will be a wake up call and will make people angry and inspire resistance against such concentrated power.
Yes, I do too. I do too. I think that would be a really important thing. I certainly think it's harder and harder for anyone uh, from across the political spectrum to say that billionaires and the super rich are broadly a benign force. That they're just a symptom of a successful economy. They're not really something we should worry about, because that seems it seems abundantly clear that's not true.
Great way to end it, Max. Hope you enjoyed today's episode. Get in touch with us on Twitter. Do recommend this. Please give us a good review.
Yes, please, everyone. Please share us. Keep listening to Equals. We've got cool guests coming up in the next few months, and we'll be in touch soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Until next time.